Today you can watch turkeys attacking people on video.
Wild turkeys are flapping down in fields, on houses, and even city infrastructure.
There are so many of them in Ontario that it has become an ordinary occurrence. But it was not always this way. In 1983, the wild turkey in the province was a nearly extinct species. Meanwhile, in the United States, there were already more than 1.3 million of them. So Ontario wildlife specialists made a strange decision, trading river otters from Ontario in exchange for wild turkeys from Missouri. By March 1984, the first wild turkey in 75 years had set foot on Ontario soil in Norfolk County. Over the next 3 years, there would be 274 of them. And then, something would go wrong, or rather, everything would go far better than expected. That would become a problem no one had anticipated. The wild turkey, Meleagris gallipovo-sylvestris, the eastern subspecies, was once part of the forests of southern Ontario. The first documented record is 1624, when Recollect missionary Gabriel Sagard described birds near Georgian Bay. This is before Ontario even had that name. Then came the Euro-Canadian settlers, and with them unregulated market hunting. Birds were killed by the hundreds and sold at city markets. At the same time, forests were being cleared for agricultural land. These were two simultaneous pressures. In 1909, the last native wild turkey in Ontario died. In the United States, by the end of the 1800s, the wild turkey population had fallen from roughly 10 million birds to a few thousand. The response was one of the most successful conservation programs in North American history through hunting regulation, habitat protection, and the transfer of birds between states. By 1973, the United States had 1.3 million wild turkeys. Today, 7 million across 49 states. Ontario watched this process from the other side of the border and had good reason to believe the same was possible for them. The geography was similar. The species was the same. But between observation and action lay several more decades, and several failed attempts that are rarely talked about. The first official discussion about returning the turkey to Ontario arose in the 1970s, but at that point the province had neither the technology nor the partners. Captive breeding programs, the only option available, were already showing failures across North America. Ontario waited. That turned out to be the right decision, even though at the time it looked like inaction. In 1983, a document appeared, Feasibility of Reintroducing Wild Turkeys into Ontario, prepared by researcher Privet. This was not a petition or a press release. It was a scientific analysis with a specific conclusion. The technology finally exists. Partners to the south are interested. The window is open. The Ministry of Natural Resources responded that same year. It formed a committee. And the following winter, Michigan called Ontario first with an offer. In the early 1980s, an idea emerged in the province: bring back the wild turkey. The initiative came from the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, a civic organization of hunters and anglers, often perceived as a lobby group, but in this case, one with a concrete scientific plan. The idea looked questionable for several reasons. First, the climate. Ontario is not Tennessee. Winter here can cut a bird population in half in a single season. The wild turkey does not migrate. It either survives in snow or it does not. Second, the early reintroduction attempts across North America had shown remarkably poor results. When birds were raised in captive enclosures and then released, they died. The reason is simple and somewhat grim. A turkey chick hatching from an egg imprints on the first living creature it sees. In nature, that is its mother. In captivity, a human being. A bird raised in an enclosure had no fear of people, vehicles, or predators. It simply walked out and died. Or, as one Ontario report put it with dry understatement, early reintroduction attempts proved fantastic for feeding local predators. The skeptics were right about those details. Captive breeding programs genuinely did not work. But they missed one thing. While the argument was still going on, the United States had already invented a solution. It is called the net cannon, a rocket-propelled device that fires a large net and covers an entire flock of birds simultaneously. Live birds from the wild, caught, transported, released. This technology changed everything. Catching was one thing. Transport was another. A live wild turkey is not a cooperative animal. The birds were packed into ventilated crates. No more than a few hours of travel was recommended. as stress alone could kill them. Teams coordinated release timing with weather windows. Too cold and newly relocated birds had no time to establish a territory before the worst of winter. Too warm and the risk of disease transmission during transit increased. Each release site had been surveyed in advance, including food availability, forest cover, and distance from the nearest farmland. The committee was, in other words, not simply moving birds from one place to another. It was a choreographed series of small, controlled gambles, each of which had to pay off independently for the program to survive politically. But technology is only half the equation. The other half is where to get the birds and on what terms. Here, a question arose that was barely discussed in public: genetic compatibility. Ontario is at the northern edge of the natural range of the eastern wild turkey. Birds from Tennessee or Missouri had evolved in a different climate. Would they survive an Ontario winter? Would they bring pathogens to which the local ecosystem had no adaptation? The Reintroduction Committee took this seriously. The solution was pragmatic. They brought birds from several states at once: Michigan, New York, Vermont, states with colder climates, and then observed which lineage established itself. This was not a clean scientific program with a control group. It was a managed experiment under real conditions, where the cost of failure was simply the absence of a result, not a catastrophe. That very logic, multiple sources, multiple lineages, a broad genetic base, would later become one of the reasons the population spread further than anyone had planned. In March 1984, the first bird arrived in Norfolk County. It came from Michigan in exchange for moose. Yes, literally, Ontario traded moose and river otters for wild turkeys. In addition to Michigan, there were agreements with New York, New Jersey, Vermont, Iowa, and Missouri. 20 years after the first release, the province would face a question that no one had included in the plan, and one that has no answer to this day. But first, what actually happened between 1984 and that moment? The annual program budget was 120,000 Canadian dollars. Of that, only 20,000 came from the provincial government. The remaining 100,000 was raised by private organizations, OFAH and the National Wild Turkey Federation. In effect, the government contributed less than 1/6 of the funding and received 100% of the political credit. Between 1984 and 1987, 274 birds were relocated to Ontario. The Reintroduction Committee was dissolved as early as 1986. The original goal, establishing the species, was considered achieved. In its place, in 1987, came a new body, the Wild Turkey Working Group, whose task was no longer restoration but the management of a growing population. And then something happened. In 1987, just 3 years after the first release, Ontario opened a spring wild turkey hunting season. There were enough birds to hunt. From 1985 to 2005, using locally bred birds without any American input, the province relocated a further 4,400 individuals to 275 sites across Ontario. The program had become self-sustaining. For comparison, the Wolf Recovery Program at Yellowstone, launched in 1995, cost more than $1 million and has remained the subject of legal disputes for decades. It restored roughly 500 individuals in its first phase. Ontario, with a budget 18 times smaller, produced a self-reproducing population in 3 years and without a single lawsuit. The difference is not in the scale of the problem. It is in the fact that the wild turkey does not frighten farmers the way a wolf does. That too is part of the equation. This is the moment to stop and reread the number. 274 birds from the United States. From those birds, the province, by its own efforts, grew a population to the point where it could supply birds to other regions. It is widely assumed that wildlife conservation is a cost, not an investment. Ontario proved otherwise. Hunting licenses, fees, equipment taxes, all of this began flowing into the provincial budget as early as 1987, 3 years after the first bird arrived. The government that put in $20,000 received a permanently renewable hunting resource and did not spend a single additional public dollar on maintaining the program. Civic organizations covered the rest themselves. Here's what was planned: return the wild turkey to Ontario, create a stable but moderate population, open a limited hunting season. Here is what happened. By the mid-2000s, there were between 70,000 and 100,000 birds. In the Ottawa region alone, there were 13,000 individuals. The birds expanded beyond their historical territory. moving into areas where they had never existed before, including agricultural land and urban fringes. The reason was not simply numbers. Birds that arrived from 6 different states carried different genetic lineages and different behavioral strategies. This made the population more adaptable than the native Ontario birds had been. The birds that arrived in 1984 came from other states and had adapted to different conditions. They were not tied to dense, old-growth forest as native Ontario turkeys had been. They fed in fields, lived at forest edges, and moved into suburbs. Residents of Saint-Sauveur, a picturesque town in the Laurentians north of Montreal, began finding birds on their balconies. This is good news, but with complications. First, the forest understory. Wild turkeys scratch and overturn soil in search of nuts, seeds, and insects. Hundreds of birds in a single forest exert real pressure on ground cover. Ontario's forests did not evolve under that kind of load from a single species. Second, conflict with farmers. There were complaints about crop damage. As biologist André Dumont at Quebec's Wildlife Department noted, research showed that most of the damage attributed to turkeys is actually caused by other animals, deer and raccoons. He explained that the turkey is a large bird, visible from a distance, and active during the day when people are also active. It is easier to blame the one you can see. There is another dimension that rarely appears in conservation reports: birds in cities. The wild turkey is about the size of a small dog, with sharp spurs and no fear of people if it is not being chased. Videos appeared in Ontario and Quebec of flocks blocking traffic at intersections, birds entering yards and refusing to leave, and one tom attacking a postal worker in Mississauga. The Canadian press covered these stories with humor, but behind the humor lies a genuine management question. What do you do with a species that has successfully adapted to a human environment and is protected by law for most of the year? The province had no ready answer. It still does not. Third, and this is the most interesting part, the population responded to climate change in a way no one had unpredicted. The softening of winters in southern Ontario and Quebec allowed birds to survive in places where the mathematics of survival had previously been against them. The reintroduction program and the climate trend reinforced each other, and the result fell outside any original projection. In 2024, Birds Canada estimated the Canadian wild turkey population at 450,000 individuals. That is 6% of the global population of the species. The province where the last bird disappeared in 1909 now holds 6% of all wild turkeys on the planet. One part of this picture remains unanswered. Is there a ceiling? Is there a point at which the population stabilizes on its own, or does active management need to hold the balance? As of 2026, that is an open question. Ontario in 1984 was not trying to restore an ecosystem. It was trying to create a new hunting opportunity and perhaps do something useful for nature. The goal was modest. The budget even more so, $120,000, of which the government provided 1/6. What happened does not fit neatly into the category of success. Is 100,000 birds a success? Yes. Did they create pressure on the forests that no one planned for? Also yes. Did the population prove sensitive to climate trends in ways that could have turned out very differently? Without question. The most honest interpretation is that the reintroduction worked. And there is a larger question this program raises, not about turkeys, but about method. Ontario did not plan any of what it got. It started a process and then let go of control. The population did the rest itself, through adaptation, through genetic diversity, through interaction with the climate that shifted in its favor. If winters had stayed as severe as they were in 1984, the numbers would be different. If the birds had come from only one state, the range would be narrower. The success of this program is partly accidental, and that does not diminish it. On the contrary, it means that in conservation work there is room for processes we cannot fully plan. You only need to choose the right moment of entry and then stay out of the way. And it revealed something we still do not fully understand. exactly how a species interacts with the landscape that changed over the 75 years of its absence.